What was the Peasants Revolt? Why did it start? And who were its key players? Let's find out in today's episode of the History Chronicles. Hello, I'm Alex and welcome to the History Chronicles. If you like our work, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the channel in return for exclusive perks, please visit our Patreon page. Now, on with the video. Today's History Chronicle begins in the 14th century AD in medieval England, a time when feudalism was the norm, having been established in the British Isles over 300 years before with the arrival of the Norman dynasty and William the Conqueror. But a number of peasants, labourers, commercial merchants and lords alike, unhappy after years of oppression and strife opposing the English crown's new poll tax, would rise up to confront the English establishment itself in a fight against tyrannical rule, paving the way for more rights and freedoms for the civilian population of England. It was England's first great popular uprising and marked a significant step in a process of incremental changes that had begun with the Magna Carta on the journey from absolute kingship to parliamentary democracy in England. It was aptly named the Peasants' Revolt, otherwise known as the Wat Tyler Rebellion. The Peasants' Revolt occurred in 1381 and was an uprising based on the social and economic discontent of predominantly the lower classes in England, particularly the rural peasantry, following a century of plague epidemics such as the Black Death, and with England's 100 Years' War against France leading to substantial increases in taxation on the general population. The 14th century was a tumultuous time for the country, and the final straw for the peasants, urban workers, artisans and traders was the introduction of the 1381 poll tax, initiated by Parliament and the prominent royal figure John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, which proved a step too far for an overburdened population who were approaching the limit of their tolerance. Society at this time was based on feudalism, with three distinct classes of people: the warrior class, the priesthood, and the peasantry, derived from a militaristic socio-economic social system that developed in France in the early Middle Ages. It was based on indentured servitude and debt bondage to the land, better known as manorialism. In the system of feudal obligation, medieval peasants, known as villeins, were strictly bound to the land in which they lived, until they could buy their freedom, paying rent to local landlords by working on an estate which was traditionally owned by members of the ruling class, such as royals, nobles, or the church. The private life of individuals was often regulated in areas such as marriage, home life, and even in death, both by the church and by the state. Some, though not all, of the rural peasantry in late 14th century England were unfree serfs, people who were legally unable to leave their lord's land to work elsewhere without that lord's permission. However, even those peasants who were legally free were often bound to a local lord's land due to a lack of economic and social power, which prevented them from finding work on land elsewhere. In return for privileges, villeins and serfs alike paid homage to their lords and offered their labour services for a share of the domestic produce, and in turn received military protection from marauders and invaders. Although they were obliged themselves to offer military service in the name of their kingdom, should their knights raise the feared or men-at-arms for international and domestic conflicts. This period reflects a time of social change that occurred in England, when ordinary civilians, feeling the plight of poverty and ruling class corruption, felt it was necessary to question their place in society rather than accept their fate at the hands of their rulers. Since 1360, Lollard priest John Ball had been preaching about peasants' rights, gaining considerable fame in England as a roving preacher, not tied to any one parish, but travelling across the country, spreading a message of social equality whilst disparaging the Catholic Church. His radicalism led him to be imprisoned multiple times, and he was banned from preaching. Yet this only enhanced his popularity, especially among the rural poor, many of whom began to recognise, through his sermons, that the oppression and hardships they faced could and should be combated. Amidst this strictly feudal political and economic setting, the incident which sparked the underlying tensions within the English system was the Black Death, and the Crown's reaction to the upheaval that it caused, as the plague utterly devastated the country, killing between 40 and 60% of the population. However, for those peasants that survived, the plague and its consequences were not wholly damaging, as the sharp drop in the supply of labourers meant that each individual agricultural labourer was now highly valuable and in great demand. Consequently, peasants demanded higher wages and the profits of landholders shrunk. In response to this economic shift, the Crown introduced emergency legislation, starting with the Ordinance of Labourers Act in 1349, followed shortly by the Statute of Labourers Act of 1351, aimed at commissioning those under 60 years old to work, making it a crime to refuse work and freezing wages to pre-plague levels, which caused widespread resentment as peasants were unable to utilise their increased value to secure better wages and conditions. Moreover, the influx of economic migrants to the country from the continent caused pressures to rise amongst domestic workers, who accused incoming workers of being the ones who demanded higher wages. In the lead-up to the large-scale disturbance, classified sociologically as a moral panic, landowners feared for their personal safety should their subjects turn on them aggressively, inviting more laws to be established by the Crown surrounding conspiracy and treason, and the penalty of imprisonment and branding was issued in the 1360s for those violating the new labour laws, showing the government's determination to enforce the oppressive economic status quo and suggesting high levels of disobedience to the laws. It must also be remembered that the 14th century had been a time of almost continuous warfare for England, with the 100 Years' War begun by Edward III in 1337 with his claiming of the French throne, providing a constant strain on the finances of the English state, especially from the 1370s onwards, as the French reversed initial English gains and English fortresses and garrisons came under increasing pressure, demanding financial support. Towards the end of Edward's reign, a poll tax was introduced, taxing all persons over the age of 14, and this raised considerable funds for the Crown, but it was widely unpopular. By 1376, 146 commune petitions were debated by the Good Parliament, citing complaints of corruption against John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, and financiers such as Richard Lyons, who was a third-party lender buying discounted debts to make a face-value profit at the behest of those otherwise struggling to pay their debts. Whereas in private, finance and royalty enjoyed an illustrious relationship, supporting the king economically. Thus, at the end of Edward III's reign, the mounting economic discontent within the country was apparent. Edward III's death in 1377 left the throne to his 10-year-old grandson Richard II, whose minority was dominated by his uncles, particularly John of Gaunt, Edward's eldest surviving son. And Richard's government set about attempting to raise money to fund England's war effort and pay the state's crippling debts. After much debate, Richard II and his court implemented the graduated poll tax in 1379, which was collected proportional to the wealth of those paying, and had followed discussions on how best to raise funds to resume the war with France, although the legislation failed to collect the funds necessary for war, resulting in a larger poll tax being instated in the Parliament of 1380, which was 3 times that of the 1377 tax and ungraduated, unlike the previous tax. This tax of 1380 was, unsurprisingly, hugely unpopular, and there was widespread evasion, leading to the Crown in early 1381 appointing commissioners to interrogate officials in towns and villages to ascertaining who was refusing to pay. And the significant powers of interference granted to these commissioners, who were especially active in the southeast, further stoked the anger of the peasantry. Indeed, it was at this time that the people of England could no longer bear the oppression they had been suffering, and the peasantry and others would react with widespread protests, most notably occurring in Shrewsbury and Bridgewater, but spreading to St Albans, Winchester and York, among other places, marking the first time in English history that an uprising comprising of multiple towns and multiple classes rose up simultaneously to oppose landlords and to oppose the English government. Although there was some level of resistance to the collection of the poll tax across the country, the most organised, effective and consequential resistance was in the southeastern counties and East Anglia, beginning in the counties of Essex and Kent in May of 1381. In and around January of 1381, tax officials were citing huge discrepancies in the money collected from previous years compared with the current numbers, urging members of the royal court to pursue the unpaid sums and punish those who were avoiding tax. In determining the numbers of people evading taxes, John Legge, tax collector for Kent, commissioned an inquiry into the number of those refusing to pay, concluding that up to 21,000 people had avoided tax payments in Norwich and Surrey alone compared to the previous year, clearly portraying the tensions in the region as resentment grew against the Crown and their tax collectors. As the number of those evading taxation increased in the 1380 levy, there was a drop of up to 37% in revenue collected compared to the previous year, with John of Gaunt instructing his tax collectors to once again raise the money owed in full, with no exception. Unfortunately, this meant that some law-abiding citizens who had already paid were expected to pay once again to account for the missing taxes. During this period, Thomas Bampton, an MP and Justice of the Peace, was ordered to complete the task in the Essex town of Brentwood on May 30th, 1381, and summoned residents from the local villages of Fobbing, Stanford and Corningham to come forth and pay their due once again to account for those unwilling to pay. Although unhappy with the demand, Bampton was challenged by Thomas Baker, a representative of Fobbing, who had stipulated that residents from his village had already paid and produced receipts as evidence, adamant that there would be no more forthcoming payments to Bampton. As a result, Baker was apprehended by Bampton and two sergeants-at-arms, leading to a clash between the opposing factions as those from Stanford and Corningham joined in the fray, driving Bampton and his men off and freeing Baker, leaving Bampton to return to London with news of a rebellion. However, 3 court clerks who were a part of Bampton's retinue and a number of people from the towns who had supported the government in collecting taxes were killed, forcing Clerk and Chief Justice Sir Robert Belknap to step in and arrest those responsible. Meanwhile, Kent and Canterbury also descended into civil unrest. Following Belknap's arrival on the 2nd of June, the situation intensified, as he was met with the same resistance from the peasants as Bampton had received, forcing him to promise never to attempt to collect the poll tax again, as his arrival triggered an escalation into mob violence and the destruction of property, in which a manor house was destroyed, including records of tax, debt, and labour duties owed to the state by the local townsfolk, while 2 of Belknap's men were captured and killed. Upon releasing Chief Justice Belknap, the rioters soon descended on the home of John Sewell, the Sheriff of Essex, burning his home to the ground, while other rioters paraded the decapitated heads of tax collectors in the surrounding villages, urging that others join in the struggle against the new tax and to ward off further attempts to collect revenue. Between the 2nd of June and the 4th of June, the leaders of the Essex movement, including Jack Straw, Thomas Farrington, Abel Kerr and Wat Tyler, held a meeting in the village of Boking, urging community leaders to encourage others to join the rebellion as they formed their demands for the abolition of serfdom and the feudal system. Furthermore, the rebels discussed their future plans, agreeing to organise a march on London, one group directly and another group approaching the capital via Kent. The next day, the 5th of June in Kent, Robert Cave, leader of some of the Kentish rebels, delivered a mission statement to the people, remarking that their movement stood with both the young King Richard, who they viewed as manipulated by nefarious advisers, and the Commons, but condemned the corruption of officials, advocating for government reform and also, again, the abolition of feudalism. And it was in Kent on the 6th of June that Rochester Castle, a bastion of the Crown's authority in the region, was stormed and its prisoners released by rebels. On the 7th of June, it is suggested that the Kentish rebels elected an Essex man by the name of Wat Tyler, a veteran of the 100 Years' War, as their leader. And sources suggest that he was a man of considerable charisma who played an important role in shaping the political goals of the revolt, whilst another prominent leader was John Ball, a radical priest who became a prophet-like figure to the rebels, inspiring them through his preaching that now was a time given to them by God. As the rebellion continued to gather pace in the southeast, by the 8th and 9th of June, protesters again targeted manor houses and official government buildings in order to destroy judicial records and tax documents, while also freeing prisoners from jailhouses and dungeons, insisting they take the oath to fight against injustice of the social system. Although protesting the poll tax, the rebels maintained that they wished to keep the monarchy as their governing body, and were instead fighting against everyday injustices of feudal obligation and the power of lords, nobles, and the clergy. Indeed, this was demonstrated on the 10th of June when Tyler's rebels entered Canterbury without resistance and forcibly deposed the Archbishop, Simon Sudbury, whilst making the cathedral monks swear loyalty to their cause. On the 11th of June, revolt leaders in Essex, Henry Baber, Thomas Farrington, John Starling, and Adam Mitchell, began a coordinated march on London from their homes in Essex, setting up camp at Mile End, East London, on the 12th of June, whilst rebels from Kent under Tyler marched from Canterbury and encamped in Blackheath in the southeast of the city, comprising of approximately 30,000 people in each group, with a further 30 to 40,000 within London itself, influenced by the cause. As protesters arrived in London, they secured access to London Bridge through sympathiser Alderman John Home and his men. Meanwhile, London Mayor William Walworth condemned the movement and ordered everyone to leave the vicinity, although his attempts were futile, and he was ignored by the protesters, who soon overwhelmed the London officials, who struggled to contain the movement without a standing army to protect it, as well as no police force. By the 13th of June, London had been entirely overrun by rebels, and without the support of the military or their warrior knights, the Tower of London's fate in London lay in the hands of Sir Robert Knoll and 1,200 troops, who protected the king and a number of royals and nobles, including Henry of Bolingbroke, the future King Henry IV, Admiral Sir John Percy, John Legge, London Mayor Walworth, Treasurer Robert Hale, and Archbishop Sudbury, who cowered within the Tower walls whilst the rebellious peasants of Essex and Kent, as well as the people of London, ransacked the capital. The destruction of the city was carried out systematically, as the rebels attacked selective properties, such as Robert Hale's Temple of the Knights Hospitallers and John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace, as John of Gaunt was an especially hated figure for the London populace. In addition, the peasants broke into the prisons of London and freed the inmates, whilst also attacking Flemish immigrants whom they associated with the mercantile wealth of the city. Indeed, some have argued that the killings of Flemish workers, of whom over 150 were executed by the mob, was organised by the London Weavers' Guilds, who were competitors with the Flemish. Isolated within the tower, the king was forced to enter into a meeting with the rebels. Thus, on the morning of the 14th of June, the 14-year-old Richard travelled to Mile End, just outside the city of London, from the Royal Tower, to meet men from Essex as they expressed their needs for communal civil rights and an end to the feudal system, although it is unclear if Wat Tyler was present at the Mile End meeting. At this meeting, Richard gave in to the demands of the peasants and asked that they go home in peace. His concessions included the abolition of serfdom and forced labour, as well as the offering of cheap land to rural workers. However, the king refused to hand over his hated taxation officials, such as the aforementioned Bampton, to the mob, knowing that to do so was to sign their death warrant. Richard also gave his word that he would issue charters of freedom for the protesters, which was well received, and the court clerks worked tirelessly to pardon and emancipate the serfs throughout the day. Richard then urged the rebels to disperse and return to their homes peacefully, offering to meet Tyler the following day with the charters. However, while Richard was at Mile End, the Tower of London was stormed by around 500 rebels who ransacked the royal palace and seized and beheaded Archbishop Sudbury and the royal treasurer Sir Robert Hales, as well as John of Gaunt's physician William Appleton, whose heads were then put on pikes and paraded around the city. However, the young Henry of Bolingbroke survived the ordeal, possibly by hiding in a cupboard. By the 15th of June, many of the rebels had followed the requests of their king and returned home, while the movement dwindled throughout the city, upon hearing of the news that Richard had welcomed the protesters' demands. However, it was on this day at Smithfield, just outside the city walls, that Wat Tyler met with the king, only to find he had been betrayed. Tyler proposed new terms to the king, as many of the Kentish rebels were unsatisfied with the charters of the previous day, asking they repeal police and labour laws passed in the last century, place limitations on lords' estates, and ensure equality of all men under the law. Although, somewhat naively, Tyler was unaware that the king's men, at least 200 strong, and many on horseback, had concealed armour and weaponry under their clothing and were ready to take the perfect opportunity to quell the uprising once and for all. Although accounts vary, what is known is that after proposing his demands to the king, Tyler became involved in an argument with Richard and his men, and the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, apparently incensed by Tyler's arrogance and disrespect towards his sovereign, or possibly responding by an attempt by Tyler to attack him, slashed at the rebel leader with a dagger, fatally wounding him. With Tyler's fall, it seemed likely that mass violence would break out. However, in an act of remarkable bravery, the 14-year-old king rode towards the rebels and appealed to them as their monarch to follow him away from Smithfield to Clerkenwell Fields, diffusing the situation and promising them further reforms in return for their dispersal. In London, Walworth had received reinforcements, and with the main body of the rebels dispersing and their leader killed, the remaining bands of peasants began to dissipate, and order was gradually restored to the capital, with the head of Wat Tyler stuck on a pike and used by the royal troops to intimidate and destroy the morale of the rebels, most of whom returned home, signalling the end of the Peasants' Revolt in London. The revolt continued in provincial England, gathering pace even as the London Rebellion was quashed, before being gradually worn down as the Crown regained the upper hand across the country. A prominent example was in East Anglia, where a major uprising was quelled by the 25th of June by the Bishop of Norwich, Henry Despenser, who executed rebels in his domain without trial. The charters granted to the rebels on the 14th and 15th of June were soon revoked, with Parliament implacably opposed to Richard's concessions and the King claiming that as the laws were granted under threat, they were not legitimate. Despite this, the poll tax that had initially ignited the revolt was withdrawn. The Crown now set about punishing the rebels, and the ringleaders of the revolt were hunted down and executed, whilst the remaining patches of rebellion were brutally crushed by royal troops and local nobles, keen to reassert their authority over the peasantry. John Ball was captured in Coventry and was hung, drawn and quartered at St Albans on the 15th of July 1381, and the head of the radical priest who had inspired so many peasants to revolt was displayed on London Bridge. The immediate aftermath of the revolt killed the morale of those involved, as the agents of the Crown and the King himself went across the country setting up courts to execute rebellious subjects and ensure the feudal system was reimposed harshly upon the peasantry. By November, approximately 1,500 people had been killed in the nationwide suppression of the revolt. However, although the Peasants' Revolt failed to end feudalism and serfdom, it paved the way for their decline, as lords freed many serfs in fear of another uprising, and peasants' rights became respected to a greater degree out of this same fear. And in time, the laws of supply and demand ensured that the wages of peasants rose, as the reduction in the number of rural workers from the Black Death ensured that the value of existing peasants rose. Although some things changed, the peasants' fight against corruption was ultimately toppled by deception and by treachery, the very corruption they opposed, adding to the struggles they had already endured. But the rebellion did highlight for everyone the unfairness of feudal society and the anger and wretchedness that it caused, leading to a greater national awareness of peasants' rights and ensuring that the lords and nobles of England remained wary of the power possessed by the rural workers. In standing up against tyranny, the rebels not only confronted the possibility of death in the face of conflict, they faced repercussions and capital punishment for their part in the events, displaying to history not only the courage of those involved, but also the dire circumstances in which they lived and wished to escape from, in the name of civil liberty. The commoners faced a devastating defeat for a number of reasons. Most notably, they were untrained in warfare and relied on large numbers to overpower the Crown, which consequently dwindled before the government put an end to the protest. Plus, with the fear of retribution, many were scared to reignite the movement or remain on the front lines for lengthy periods of time, as many had families to tend to. The goals of the revolt failed to materialize immediately. These were the end of feudalism and the suppression of wages, which remained unchanged. However, despite the grueling clampdown on those protesting the poll tax in London, some changes were successfully made, such as the end of serfdom and imposed servitude to a single lord, allowing men and women to move between lords and employers in seek of higher wages, but also to buy and sell goods. Moreover, many of those from the peasantry class enjoyed an increase in living standards in the decades following the revolt, as wages gradually rose, and in the broader picture, the uprising had set a precedent in England's history, setting the stage for further rebellions and more limitations on the king's power, leading England, eventually, towards the freedoms many in the Western world and beyond witness to this day. In 14th century England, those acting for civil rights and demanding a better quality of life faced true danger in expressing their thoughts and demand, for the concept of freedom of expression was yet to be born in England, and speaking out against the Crown and the established economic and social order in many cases could cost someone their life. Thus, the bravery of the commoners that partook in this revolt must be admired, especially the leaders such as Wat Tyler and John Ball, most of whom ultimately gave their lives for the cause. The Peasants' Revolt was not purely revolutionary in spirit or anti-nobility. It instead symbolized a desire for freedom, social mobility, respect and fairness within an inherently stratified system, But it was also a wish to be included as a recognised part of the society in which they lived, demanding better treatment and the right to lead their lives in a peaceful and self-determined way, without unwarranted intrusion by the government and local lords. Throughout history, the men and women who fought against tyranny will always be remembered, for many lost their lives fighting for freedom, something which remains highly admired and relevant to this day. The Wat Tyler Rebellion is an archetypal representation of the continuous struggle of the common individual, who, after hundreds of years of questioning the role of government and kingship, achieved civil freedom. The Peasants Revolt remains a key event, which should be remembered, as one day those very rights may be challenged, and their struggle represents a tradition which must continue in order to secure the right to live in an individualistic society, free from unfair treatment and unnecessary persecution. You have been watching the History Chronicles. We'd love to know what you think of the Peasants Revolt. Please let us know below, and if you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Also, if you'd like to support our work going forward, please visit our Patreon page, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the History Chronicles.